You never know, as a book author, you never know how that sentence is going to end when you say, I walked into a conversation, they were talking about this book. It could have been, hey, you need to read it too, or it could have been, hey, don't waste your money on this book. I did you the service of wasting my own money on it, so you couldn't do it either. I'm glad to hear that it sounds like people found it valuable. Hopefully they'll find this hot walk through the content valuable as well. We'll, as Dan said, spend about 30 minutes going through the very high level. Obviously, we're not going to get to, we just hit the tip of the iceberg here. And what I suggest is if anybody wants to continue the dialogue, by all means, reach out to me directly on LinkedIn. It's a great place to get a hold of me if you have follow-up questions that we don't address in today's session. I'm going to be walking through this content. This is from our latest book. It came out in September of last year. There's a lot more about all of the techniques that I will provide a high-level overview of in the book. So obviously a lot more where this came from if you are interested in learning more or bringing this to your sales teams. But let's jump into it. I've often been accused of being sort of the harbinger of doom on presentations. So with the Challenger sale, for those of you who know, that started with this finding that customers are nearly 60% of the way through their buying journey before they ever reach out to a salesperson. And then we went on to reveal what the best salespeople have done differently, what they do differently in a world where customers can learn on their own. And this story starts in the same similar kind of depressing place, but we will get to the good news in a moment. So let me share with you a disturbing finding from a large-scale global study that we ran over the past couple of years, continuing to collect data on this. And in fact, this finding is now a bit dated. I'll explain in just a moment. We collected data from a range of companies around the world, and we found that anywhere between 40 and 60% of the average salesperson's pipeline, qualified pipeline, will wind up lost to no decision. The reason for that range, just to put a finer point on this, is that we find that in more complex solution sales, so think about sales that are truly transformational, long sales cycle, high value contracts, lots of stakeholder involvement, extended POCs, this kind of thing, the no decision loss rate is a bit lower because the customer thinks twice before wasting their own time. I would say they would think twice about wasting your time, but let's be honest, they're really thinking twice about wasting their own time before engaging with you in evaluating a solution if they know that it's unlikely they'll make a decision. In more transactional sales, so lower contract size, less disruptive, think about deals that are closed in the span of a few interactions, not months and quarters of time that you spend with the customer. The no decision loss rate is actually quite a bit higher. It's closer to 60%. And the reason, of course, is that, if it's not a huge time investment, it attracts a lot of window shoppers. So this, regardless of where you fall in this continuum, what I would tell you is that this represents a massive productivity loss for your sellers and across your entire go-to-market operation. If you think about this multiplied across your sales force, and to be very clear, these are customers who will engage with us, who will often go through pilots, demos, do reference calls, pull in all of their stakeholders, their corporate departments, procurements, legal, finance, all the sales prevention folks that they work with, pull them in to evaluate the proposal, and then ultimately disengage from us. Now, some customers will do us the courtesy of telling us now is not the right time. We're going to push this decision out a bit farther. But most customers actually do it without telling us. So they will go radio silent. They will ghost us, as my kids like to say. They'll stop responding to our emails in the sort of flirting way they once did, and now it becomes these episodic kind of curt replies. We're always floating our emails to the top of their inboxes to try to stay front of mind. And it turns out at some point our manager tells us this deal is lost. The customer is disengaged. Clearly they've moved on. It's time to pull the plug on this. Mark it as close loss, no decision in the CRM system. This is a bit autobiographical, but I've often said it reminds me a bit of my dating life in university where the relationship was over. It just took me a couple of months to figure out it was over. This is life for your salespeople. Now, the reason I said I think this is a bit dated is that we pulled this figure, this analysis about 12 months ago, 18 months ago is when we started to surface this. Think about what that no decision loss rate is today with the economy kind of uncertain as to whether we're heading into recession or not. I'm hearing this from sales teams all over the world across industry. that customers are pushing out big decisions, that they're disengaging without telling us that they're planning to disengage, or just avoiding making a decision entirely. So it is a massive productivity sink for us in sales. And of course, the question is twofold. One is, why do customers do this? What possesses them to do such a thing? And then two, what do the best salespeople do differently to avoid this? Now, to answer those questions, we actually embarked on a research study back in March of 2020, a time that I think we'll all remember with mixed emotions. But it was an interesting time in the world of sales, which is that the world of sales literally turned upside down in a blink of an eye. We had always been doing, especially in technology sales, a portion of the sales process was handled over Zoom or Teams or other virtual platforms. But in March of 2020, the entirety of the sales process flipped over to virtual. So we were not visiting customers in their office. We were not meeting them at the trade show. We were not out in the field engaging with our customers, doing site visits, et cetera. Now everything was happening on virtual platforms. And for us, as researchers, this created a kind of once in a lifetime opportunity to study sales in a completely different way. So we went out and we recruited several dozen companies from across industry around the world into a project where we asked them to submit to us their recorded sales conversations. So we collected 2.5 million sales conversations across about an 18-month period starting in the spring of 2020. We transcribed all of that data. Much of it was unstructured audio. We transcribed it into unstructured text using a transcription engine, and then we studied it with a machine learning platform. All told, our model had 8,300 different independent variables in it, looking at combination sequences of variables. It was such a big model that we built, it actually broke a number of the off-the-shelf analysis packages that we had bought for this purpose. So our data science team built their own math solver that wrote their own code to be able to study this data set. Now, all of the findings, as Stephen said before, are packaged in this book, The Jolt Effect, which again came out last year, but I'll give you the high level of what we found. I started with a depressing finding that 40 to 60% of our deals will be lost to no decision. Let me show you the good news, jump to kind of the end. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. It is not an oncoming train. There is hope for us in sales. When we look at what the difference between high performer and average performer win rates, unsurprisingly, they're dramatically different. In our study, average performer win rates were 26%, high performer win rates were closer to 60%. But here's the thing, that in and of itself shouldn't surprise anybody on this call, but this did surprise us, which is across all of the variables we studied, the biggest predictor of difference, the biggest explainer of this difference was how high performers dealt with that moment of hesitation, kind of the cold feet moment in the sale. This is the point after which the customers articulated the status quo is suboptimal. We want to move forward with you as a solution provider, as a vendor. But before the point where they actually sign the agreement, where things start to go a bit sideways, it was how high performers dealt with those moments that explain the vast majority of this difference in win rates. So let's talk a bit about what high performers do. But before we do so, I think it's important that we level set or provide a baseline on what most salespeople do when when the deal starts to slip away. Now, what you're looking at here is sort of a prototypical buying process. It doesn't look like any of your sales processes, but I would argue that any business-to-business sale is a 3-act play. We engage our customer in their status quo. This is the way they do things today. Maybe they use a competitor's solution. Maybe they've had no need for a solution like yours, so they use a spreadsheet or they do it manually. It's a homegrown solution. Or perhaps they do use your product or your service, but they use it in a narrow and use case specific way, and you're trying to get them to expand into more of an enterprise relationship with you. Use our platform across the entirety of your business. Whatever it is, that is the customer's status quo, the way they do things today. Now, the first step in the sale, of course, is to get them to agree to a vision, right? Agree that the status quo is suboptimal, in that partnering with you as a solution provider will transform the way that they do things, and to choose that path of action, right? The last step in the journey is we got to get them from saying they want it to getting them to buy it, right? From intent to action. We got to get them to execute the DocuSign, to sign on the dotted line. So that is our simple 3-act play. Now, as I mentioned before, in our study, we found that there's this moment where a lot of deals go sideways. And it happens between the point where the customer says they want it and the point where they actually buy it, where the customer starts to relitigate concerns, raise objections that you thought you had addressed long ago. They start to hem and haw, they straddle the fence, they wring their hands, they wonder if this is really the right way forward for their business. Again, it felt like this was a sure thing, but suddenly it feels like the deal is starting to slip away. Now, in sales, for I'd argue the last half century at least, we've argued and trained and coached to our salespeople that there's only one reason that the deal that seemed like a sure thing is suddenly slipping away. And that is because we failed to conquer the status quo, right? We failed to convince the customer that what they're doing today is not good enough, that moving forward with us is the best option for their business. We failed to differentiate, we failed to convey the value, or we just failed to convince them that this is a top priority in their business to solve this opportunity, to address this problem or this opportunity. And so what we tell our salespeople to do is go back and defeat the status quo, because clearly you didn't do so. If the customer who said they were ready to move forward starts to slip away, then clearly they're still in the gravitational pull of the status quo. So not surprisingly, we found that the vast majority of sellers do that. They go back, they break out their status quo hammer and they go to town. Now, the way this comes across in sales conversations is one of three different techniques that we found. The first one I would call kind of the carrot approach. This is where we try to re-articulate the benefits of our solution. You know, Stephen, you must have missed how many zeros were on that ROI projection that I put in front of you. Let me show that to you again. Clearly, you're not impressed enough because everyone else thinks this is pretty good. Or, you know, Dan, you must have blinked when we went through the demo. This one feature, every other customer is just blown away by this, and you didn't seem quite as enthralled about it. So let me get in there and show you again and really try to communicate the value. So that's, again, the positive. What I'm trying to do is show you all the benefits that you are going to miss out on if you don't move forward. If that doesn't work, I put away the carrot and I break out the stick. And this is, Stephen, you mentioned this before, the FUD approach: fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So what I'm trying to do here is to create a burning platform that the customer has no choice but to abandon, to help them realize that these problems won't solve themselves. Their competitors are gaining ground on them and opening a gap in the marketplace. Their customers hate them, their employees hate them, their shareholders hate, everybody hates them. And it's all their fault for creating this terrible state of affairs, this terrible status quo. You can't fix these problems on your own. You've got to move forward. You have no choice but to act. So again, trying to make the customer squirm a bit and realize the cost of their inaction. If those two techniques don't work, almost every salesperson in our study went to the final desperation tactic, which is the 10% discount that's only good this quarter. So that ended up being the final attempt when the customer is unmoved by the positive or that negative approach. Now, what's interesting, I would characterize all of these as flavors of the same thing. These are all what I would call FOMO tactics. What we're trying to do is convey to the customer, dial up the fear of missing out. We know our customers are motivated by that. We know they don't like their current state. They know they don't want to lose ground to competitors. They know they don't like being hated by their employees or by their customers. They know they need to solve this. And we know that they don't want to pay more next quarter when the prices go up. So we try to dial up the FOMO. Again, none of this will surprise you. In fact, I might argue it's encouraging because salespeople are doing what they've been taught to do by us for many, many years. And those of you who know the challenger sale know that we also argued that challengers are differentiated. One of the ways that they're differentiated is that they're very good at showing the customer that the pain of same is worse than the pain of change. But this part did surprise us, is that the vast majority of the time when we're dealing with a customer who's articulated to us that the status quo is no longer acceptable, that they want to work with us as a solution provider, they're ready to move forward, and then they start to hesitate and disengage, when we go up and dial up the FOMO, it actually doesn't just not work, it actually makes things worse. In other words, it increases the odds the customer will end up in no decision. Now, this was a bit of a head scratcher to us because it, again, flies in the face of much conventional sales wisdom that we've been proselytizing and training and coaching on for many, many years. The first thing we did as good researchers is we were convinced this was a mistake. And so we told our data science team to go back and check the data. They assured us it was not a mistake. We said, well, let's wait till we get more data. We fed more data into the model and the effect actually got worse, not better. So we decided, well, there's got to be an explanation here. So we went back into the data and we found something pretty surprising. It turns out that when a deal is lost to no decision, there are two reasons that happens. Now, remember, in the world of sales, for your average salesperson, they've grown up in a world believing that there is only one reason this happens, because the customer believes what they're doing today is good enough, that what you are talking about is not a more compelling alternative, or this is not a top priority in their business. That is all status quo bias, right? We have taught them that that is the only reason a customer is not moving forward, especially if they said they wanted to move forward and then they start to wriggle out of our hands. It is because they're still in the grips of the status quo. But it turns out there's a second reason that leads to no decision losses, which has nothing to do with the status quo. This is the customer's indecisiveness or indecision, which itself stems from their fear of failure around this purchase decision. Now, that is surprising, again, because salespeople live in a world where no decision losses are driven only by the customer's preference for their status quo. And now we've realized that in a world where salespeople have been taught the status quo is their only, if not biggest competitor, it is not their only competitor. And here's the other wrinkle. It's also not their biggest competitor. More no decision losses are a function of fear of failure than of the customer's preference for the status quo. Now, you might look at this and say, well, I get it, the math makes sense, but why do customers, these business leaders, right, who should be making decisions off of ROI and rational concerns, why do they obsess about fear of failure? Why is it such a big deal? Well, it turns out this is deeply rooted in human psychology. I'll draw upon these two folks. We actually did a fair amount of reading of social science research. We read about 30 years of behavioral economics and human psychology journal articles, which I wouldn't wish upon any of you because it's extremely boring stuff. But there were some insights in here that are really important for salespeople to understand. The most important one is this. It comes from these two guys. That's Daniel Kahneman on the right and Amos Tversky on the left, his now deceased but longtime research colleague. The reason that fear of failure is such a big deal to people and to business customers, because they're people after all, they may not act like it all the time, but they are. The reason fear of failure is such a big deal has to do with what Tversky is talking about here, which is our natural stupidity. Now, these guys discovered something that I think many of you are familiar with, an idea called prospect theory, which is also this idea of loss aversion. Simply put, prospect theory holds that people are wired to avoid loss more than they want to maximize gain. This is why your salespeople dial up the FUD. This is why they use that 10% discount to try to convince the customer to buy now instead of delaying the decision, because we know people don't like to lose. But there's a really important wrinkle to their research, and one that I think goes unappreciated, certainly by the average salesperson. That is what you see here. Kahneman and Tversky found, and this has been validated now across decades of human psychology and economics research, that there are two different types of loss that human beings think about. The first one is called an error of omission. An error of omission is when we experience a loss by doing nothing. We experience a loss because we sat on the fence. We stayed on the sidelines, and a loss resulted from that inaction. It's a loss that results from doing nothing. Now, that is different from what you see on the right. And on the right-hand side is the error of commission. An error of commission is quite different. This is where you experience a loss not by doing nothing, but by doing something. You made a decision, you chose a path of action, and that decision or that path of action resulted in a loss. And that loss is directly attributable to the decision that you made. Now, these are drawn as the same side on the slide, but in the human mind, they appear this way. It turns out that human beings don't really care very much about errors of omission. They're okay with missing out. But what they're not okay with is personal responsibility, making decisions, choosing a path of action that results directly in a loss. They're not okay with messing up. And that's the shorthand I provide to salespeople. The punchline, if you will, here is that it turns out in your customer's mind, the fear of missing out, that 10% discount, the inability to solve an urgent need in their business, to close ground on their competitors, to capitalize on all the benefits of your solution, the fear of missing out pales in comparison to the FOMO, which is the fear of messing up. Others have used the not safe for work FOFU version. I'll let you figure out on your own what this stands for. But that is a really, really important thing for salespeople to realize. If I were to bring it back to the beginning, remember, we found not just that those FUD techniques, those FOMO techniques are unproductive with a customer who's already articulated their desire to move forward from the status quo, to move forward with you as a solution provider. It's not just that they're unproductive, they're counterproductive. They make things worse. The reason is, simply put, that when we do that, what we're doing is using scare tactics to sell to somebody who's already afraid. but they're not afraid of missing out. They're not afraid of missing out on your 10% discount, or missing out on the benefits of your solution, or missing out on an opportunity to solve this terrible status quo and address this state of affairs. They're worried about something else, and that is much bigger for them, which is being personally responsible for a decision or a purchase that goes sideways, and potentially losing face, incurring the wrath of their colleagues or their higher ups, or potentially losing their job, especially in this current environment. Now, what is it that customers are so concerned about? Well, customers get concerned about a lot of things, but it turns out in the research, there were three primary fears that customers articulated. The first one is called the valuation problem. This is where the customer is struggling with what to choose and what not to choose. Think about any of your products or solutions that you bring to customers. I'm willing to wager that there are lots of versions of those products. You have partner ecosystems and integrations. You have premium versions and basic versions. You have different contract lengths. You have use case specific deployments. You have enterprise-wide deployments, right? You have roadmap items with new capabilities coming off the assembly line all the time. This is where the customer looks at all those options, and they decide that they all look pretty good. But in a world where they all look about the same and they all look pretty good, the best decision is to choose none of them, because you don't want to be responsible for making the wrong choice. So the customer sits on the sidelines, not because they're swayed by the status quo, but because they're worried about picking the wrong thing. Oh, it turns out we found out after the purchase was made that this solution doesn't integrate with our legacy systems, or it doesn't do what we thought it was capable of. So that, again, a valuation problem. I'm worried about what to choose. It's the choice overload problem that we develop and we actually encourage in many respects with our customers. The second problem is information overload. So this is where the customer worries about not having done enough research around this purchase that we're asking them to make. And you think about the amount of information in any of your industries, around any of your technologies, the information you put out, the information your competitors put out, the information from third-party analysts like Gartner, Forrester, and others, information available on LinkedIn from their own professional networks. It is literally impossible for customers to consume all of this information, but that doesn't stop them from trying. And the reason they try is because they want to avoid the mistake of being surprised after the implementation that there was some piece of information that they didn't uncover during their due diligence. And then fingers are pointed and questions are asked about whose job was it to do all this research, to leave no stone unturned. And it turns out it was your job and you didn't do enough due diligence. And now we've been surprised in a bad way. That's a bad look for a customer. The last fear of failure is outcome uncertainty. This is where the customer is worried that they won't see the benefits that you're projecting. What's interesting about this is they very rarely blame the vendor. They believe you. They know you do great work. They believe your reference customers. They believe your case studies, your proof points, your ROI projection. They often, more often than not, blame themselves. You know, Dan, I know you've been saying that every customer you work with gets like a 5x ROI at least on this purchase, but you've got to understand we are a highly dysfunctional organization. There is no way we could get that kind of gain or benefit. I can't put my name to a business case that has that kind of projection for my CFO, because if it doesn't come to pass, it'll be me left holding the bag. So this is the customer's concern that they will be left without a safety net, without somebody there to catch them if things go sideways, if things start to slip. So those are the three fears of failure. Again, we could easily have a customer who's thoroughly convinced that the status quo is suboptimal, is completely convinced that we are the right partner to move forward with, but instead is worried about one of these three things. Have I configured the solution the right way? Have I made the right decisions about what's in and what's out of the proposal? Have I done enough research, or am I going to be surprised after the implementation in a bad way? Have I left no stone unturned? And lastly, does this vendor have my back? Am I assured of success here, or could this end up blowing up on me? And again, I could be hung out to dry if we don't get the benefits that are projected. Now, what I'd share with you is that, I said earlier in the challenger sale, we've argued that challengers are quite good at defeating the status quo. It's one of the things that makes them very distinct. And our first thought was that what we found here suggests that maybe that playbook was wrong. And so I was preparing not for a book tour, but maybe an apology tour with sales leaders around the world. That book's been out for 10 years. And it's not just Challenger. There are thousands of sales books that have been written on the need to answer the why change question for the customer to convince them to move forward. What we found was not that those playbooks don't matter. In fact, I'd say quite the opposite. Remember, 44% of no decision losses are a function of the customer's preference for their status quo. And those are only the no decision losses. Think about the losses where the customer tells you they're comfortable with their status quo. They tell you they don't believe your solution is preferable to what they do today, or they tell you it's not a big priority. So those are decisions, right? Those are not no decision losses, those are decisions. So status quo is a huge enemy in sales. If we don't overcome the status quo, we're not going to sell a thing. And then indecision is a secondary problem. It's not actually a concern if you can't convince a customer that what they're doing today is not good enough. So we've got to beat the status quo. So the message is, whether you're a challenger shop, you're a medic shop, the Sandler shop, it doesn't matter. You should become world-class at beating the status quo, because it's a very powerful enemy in sales. But what high performers have realized is that that's not enough. Because again, once the customer stops obsessing about whether what they do today is good enough, they start obsessing with, have they configured this the right way? Have they done enough research? And do you have my back? Are you going to support me on this journey, or leave me hanging out to dry? And so high performers shift gears from beating the status quo to overcoming customer indecision, shifting in many respects from being a salesperson to actually becoming more of a buyer's agent over the course of the sale, instilling the confidence with the customer. They've made a great decision. They've made the right decisions about what's in and what's out of the proposal. They've done plenty of research. Better yet, they're working with a trusted advisor who obviates the need to read everything, because I've read everything, and then again, I'm going to guide you to the information you need and what you can ignore. And lastly, I provided every assurance that we're going to experience at least these benefits, if not perform better. You're going to look like a hero, not like a fool from doing this. So the playbook, which again, maybe we'll get to here in the discussion on the Q&A, very, very high level. We identified 4 behaviors that high performers use to get customers to move from intent to action, from agreement on a vision to purchase decision. We call it the Jolt Effect. Jolt is an acronym, as you can see here. We judge the level of indecision, we offer a recommendation, we limit the exploration, and then we take risk off the table. I'll say just a quick word about each one, and then pull in Bart and Dan. But what we found is we like this because it's memorable for salespeople, but it also speaks to what's happening. The customer is stuck in their fear of failure and indecision. We're trying to spur them into action, to get them to move forward, to move from I want this to I bought this. The first thing we've got to do is we've got to get their fear of failure on the table so that it can be discussed. And there's a funny thing about that, which is it's not something your customers like to discuss. Nobody is going to raise their hand and say, you know, Dan, I'm quite worried about getting fired by signing off on this purchase. that is not something that certainly seasoned executives and managers are comfortable talking about. So, but we've got to understand as salespeople, how indecisive is this customer? Are there contextual factors amplifying their indecision? Because that tells us, what is our playbook for getting the customer over the finish line? And how should we forecast this opportunity? And in extreme cases, should we disqualify it? Is it worth our time? Second, we've got to offer a recommendation. Remember, the customer is suffering from choice overload. What best salespeople do is they narrow the consideration set, and then they advocate. They use what Stephen talked about before, advocacy, to recommend a specific course of action to the customer. We put a lot in front of you, but Stephen, based on what I've seen and what I understand about your organization, here's what I would recommend. And that recommendation is not, as you suspect the waiter will do at the restaurant, recommending the most expensive bottle of wine or the most expensive entree. It's typically not that. I recommend we actually start a bit smaller than maybe you're thinking about. I recommend the basic version, not the premium version. I recommend we put that integration on hold for now. Here's what I'd recommend. I think it's the right use of your money. It's the right decision. It sets us up for success and expanding our relationship over time. L is limiting the exploration. We've got to get the customer to stop trying to be an expert and start trusting us as an expert, which comes down to 2 things. You've got to build a bank of goodwill and trust, which we found a specific set of techniques high performers use to do that. And secondly, you've got to demonstrate expertise. And that's a difficult thing in today's sales world, where salespeople have become accustomed to bringing the clown car of experts to every single sales call, the subject matter experts, the solutions engineers, the executive sponsors, the CS team members. The salesperson themselves needs to be seen as more than a glorified admin, somebody who can take the customer by the hand and guide them through the sea of information they're wading through to make a good decision. Lastly, we've got to take risk off the table. In the final analysis, where the customer is worried about whether they're going to see the benefits, we've got to create a safety net. This is typically not an opt-out clause. It's a different set of techniques we find high performers use to instill confidence with the customer that, again, worst case scenario, this is going to produce this, but I think we're going to overperform. We're going to generate at least those returns. You're going to look like a hero, not like a fool. And here's how we're going to guarantee success and assure success for you and your team. Now, again, that is the Jolt Effect. Let me show you very quickly the returns on that, and I'll go over to Dan here. So we were able to array opportunities by level of indecision. You've got decisive customers on the left, those who are unencumbered by fear of failure. By the way, that is 13% of the market universe. So there are not very many decisive customers out there. Most people are indecisive, even though they don't like talking about it. In the middle, you've got your moderately indecisive customers. On the right, you've got your highly indecisive customers. On the left-hand side, you find that average performers, core performing salespeople, do quite well. They convert nearly 40% of the opportunities where customers are unencumbered by fear of failure. If you find a customer like that, by all means, you should sell them as much as you can, as soon as you can. And even book writers like myself, who just study sales and don't actually do sales, like people like you, are quite good at sales in this environment when people are ready to make a decision. But when they become a bit hesitant, when they suffer from moderate levels of indecision, our win rate regresses back to the mean, 26%. And when they become deeply indecisive, things fall apart dramatically, only a 6% win rate. Now, when we compare those with Jolt sellers, these are the sellers doing the 4 things I described very quickly a moment ago, judging the indecision, offering recommendations, limiting the exploration, taking risk off the table for the customer. When they do those things, they convert orders of magnitude better. So nearly a 2x better win rate with decisive customers on the left. Moderately indecisive customers, a greater than 2x win rate with those customers. These are customers with cold feet. And on the right-hand side, these are the customers not with cold feet, but the ones who are encased in ice, so mired in indecision, so worried about failure that it seems impossible to move that forward. They produce a 5x greater win rate with those customers. So again, with what we talked about earlier, the propensity for customers before the current economic environment and fears about recession sort of inundated all of us, we were losing 40 to 60% of our deals to no decision. That number is undoubtedly much higher today as people kick decisions out, they push out big transactions and big investments, and they keep their powder dry. And what we found here is a playbook that high performers have figured out on their own without ever being trained or coached to do it, a playbook for overcoming that indecision, which again is something we talk more about in a lot more detail in the book. So with that, Dan, let me pull you in here. I will close this out for, actually, you know what, Dan, if you want, I can leave it open. There's some more information here for how to get a hold of me if you'd like to follow up. But again, LinkedIn is probably the medium of choice if you'd like to send a follow-up question. But